at Utah State University. I am also the director of the Free Roaming Equids and Ecosystems Sustainability Network, or what we call FREEZE for short. A brief history on FREEZE. It is a consortium of scientists, advocates, landowners, and natural resource managers that formed a collaborative network in 2019 to promote science-based education and outreach, specifically related to the ecology and management of feral burros and horses on Western rangelands. Our goal at FREEZE is to provide a safe learning environment for people from diverse backgrounds to engage in discussions around the management of wild equids, to promote collaborations, networking, and connections, to encourage creativity and novel ideas, learn about scientific approaches to ecology and management of these animals, and lastly, to participate in outreach and education around broader questions related to natural resources in an era of rapid change. We are pleased that you could be here for the 6th of our monthly webinar series. And in the coming year, we'll address a wide range of topics on horses and burros. This is one of them. Today's speaker, we are going to talk about the behavior of wild horses in rangeland settings. And to do this, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sarah King from Colorado State University. Sarah is a research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at CSU. She is also co-chair of the IUCN's Equid Specialist Group and a longstanding member of the FREEZE Steering Committee. Sarah earned her bachelor's and PhD degrees from Queen Mary's College in London. Most of her career has been spent studying the behavior and ecology of wild and feral equids, including the behavioral ecology of the Przewalski's horses after their reintroduction back into the wild in central Mongolia. And she's promised to come back at another time and tell us all about that. A very exciting project. More recently, Sarah has collaborated with the U.S. Geological Survey to lead behavioral aspects of research into feral horses and burros in the American West, and much of today's conversation will be on that work. In terms of wild horse management, she has played her part by adopting a Mustang from one of her field sites back in 2022, and I'm sure we will see pictures of him as well. Throughout her career, Sarah's work is focused on applying research of mammalian behavior and ecology to the conservation of endangered species or the management of those that are abundant. So, last note here, after the presentation, you can type in questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. King. Thank you for being here, Sarah. We're really excited to have you and interested to hear about your work.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do that. Hi, yeah, well, welcome. So today I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is behavior of wild horses and burros. And I want to acknowledge that this work was done, almost everything that I'm going to present was done in close collaboration with USGS, and particularly my co-author on the research was Kate Schoenecker. So I want to give a lot of thanks and acknowledgement to USGS and to Kate. So David's already gave a nice introduction. Yeah, so this is me with my Mustang, who's called Cowboy. Yeah, so I've spent most of my career doing research on wild or feral horse behavior, and also looking at donkey behavior or burro behavior as well. And so I have a lot of history, a lot of field experience of studying this subject. And I'm also an animal trainer, and so I do positive reinforcement with my horse as well as with dogs. So in this talk today, I'm going to start with talking about behavior, talking about why we measure it and how we measure it. Then I'm going to take a step back a little bit and talk about horse and burro ancestry and what that means for the behavior that we're seeing in currently. And then I'll go into a bit more depth about maintenance behaviors of horses, so the basic behaviors that we see. And then I'll also talk about the social behaviors. And with the maintenance behaviors and the social behaviors, I'm going to be talking about horses and burros. And then finally, I'll wrap it all up. We're talking about what this all means. And then, yeah, hopefully there'll be time for questions. So why do we want to study behavior? And so this is a Przewalski's horse in Mongolia. And so the study of behavior is called ethology. And it's a really useful thing to understand because it can really help us see the effects of management, maybe before they're really apparent. So with the feral, the wild horses, we are often using fertility control or other management actions. But then looking at their behavior, we might be able to see effects of this even before it's apparent in the actual population size. And then when we're talking about looking at the behavior of a species like the Przewalski's horse, then we can also understand like how can we use our knowledge of their behavior to help conserve them in the wild. And then also all of this understanding of the behavior of wild and feral horses can then be used to inform the welfare of domestic horses. So when we have horses in our backyards or in our pastures, then we can use what we understand for when they're behaving like their natural behavior out on the range and how we can bring that and to help improve their welfare at home. So how do we measure behavior? So first of all, we create a list of behaviors that's called an ethogram. And then we use this list of behaviors that we carefully develop based on our own observations and based on the observations of scientists that come before, so that we know exactly what behaviors that we're going to record. And then we can record this behavior using a variety of different methods. So we can use scan sampling, which means that we pick a certain amount of time, and then we're going to record what all of the horses are doing exactly at that point in time. And then focal sampling, which is where we record everything that the animals do continuously over a certain period of time. Then there's all occurrence sampling, which is where you just record every single time something happens. And then we can also add in radio collar data. And so radio collar data, of course, is really great to look at movements of animals and also to help us find them when they're out on the range. And these days, radio collars can come with all sorts of additional fancy bells and whistles. So they can have accelerometer data, so you know whether the animal's heads are up or down and what they're doing. And even collars now can tell you if if two individuals are in close proximity to each other. The data that I'm going to present here, and so the methods that we used in our studies on the horses out on the range, we used scan sampling. So every 10 minutes during an observation hour, we would record what the horses or burros were doing. And we also used all occurrence sampling to look at their social behaviors, because these behaviors are often less frequent. And so then using the all occurrence sampling meant that we could catch every like rare kick when it happened. And then we also used radio collar data to look at home ranges and habitat use that I'm not going to talk about today. So the data that I'm going to present that we collected was at 2 horse sites. So we had Conga, which is where my personal horse is from, and Frisco out in Western Utah. And then we had 2 burro study sites that were Sinbad in central Utah and Lake Pleasant, which is in central Arizona. And so what we would do is we would use the radio collars on the horses or the burros to go out and find the individuals. And then we would record data of the behavior of the whole group so that we knew who what everybody in that whole group was doing. And so first question that you might have when I talk about radio collars was, did radio collars affect the animal's behavior? And this is something that that we wanted to check out first as well. And so we did a year-long preliminary study on some wild horses that were off-range in Oklahoma. And so we had collars on these animals for a year so we could look at any effects on them and on their behavior. And then our field study that also included another site in Wyoming we had 105 horses and 60 burros that we had data with their radio collars on them for 4 years. And really, we found that there were minimal effects of radio collars on their behavior. And we also didn't find any concerning other impacts of collars as well. So I think that I feel confident in saying that wearing a radio collar did not affect these animals' behavior, especially the data that I'm going to present. So we had these 4 study sites. So we had Frisco and Congo, which are the 2 horse sites. And so we collected data, and Sinbad and Lake Pleasant are the 2 burro sites. And we collected data at each of these sites for about 4 years. And we started our study with at least 100 animals at each of these sites. And then we had radio collars on a large proportion of the females at each of these sites at the beginning as well. And then we collected data on these animals year round, looking at group structure so that we really knew which animals were with each other and when they left their groups. And so also we could look at births and deaths that way as well. And then we also collected behavioral data at Conga, the horse site, and then at Sinbad and Lake Pleasant to look at the behavior of the burros. And so with the Utah sites, we only looked at the behavior between March and September, which is when they're most active. And so that's the breeding season. And also when we had best access to the sites. And then at Lake Pleasant, we could look at that year round. Oh, okay. That was interesting. So yeah, so horses and burros have different ancestors. So I think that, we think about the horses that we see, but horses, so the domestic horse, Equus caballus, has a common ancestor with the Przewalski's horse. And so, and then the donkey, the feral donkey or the burro, their ancestor is the African wild ass, which is the species in this picture above that is only found in the Horn of Africa, And right now it's really incredibly endangered species. And so we know that they have these different ancestors, and these different ancestors have different social systems. So I think that everyone is pretty familiar with the horse social system, that we typically have a stallion, like an adult male who's then associated with females, or females associate with him, and then also their offspring. And then they all move around together in this very tight social group. Whereas African wild asses, they have a completely different social system. So, so with horses, we can think of it as a female defense social system, that the males are defending their access to females. Whereas in African wild asses, we often see females off on their own, and they have what's called a fission fusion social system. So individuals will come together and go apart with no permanent social bonds between them. And in that system, the males are more likely to defend an area, such as near a water source. And then they will mate with females as the females come to use that water source. And so we were interested whether we are seeing these ancestral systems in the wild horses and burros out on the range. And we did. So in this picture, you can see, so all of the blue circles are females and the yellow squares are males. And so you can see that we saw these harem groups of one male and a group of females in the horses. And then with the donkeys, it was really quite common to see females on their own or just hanging out with other females and their offspring. And so they had these very different social systems where the horses would remain in these really quite stable social groups over a long period of time, whereas the donkeys would sometimes hang out together and then they'd sometimes go apart and be on their own, and really having this fission fusion social system. And this graph on the right is showing also, so we've got the horses in the blue colors and the donkeys in the pink colors. And it was really rare to see a horse female without being associated with a male. Whereas with the donkeys, it was actually not uncommon at all to see a female just out on her own without associating with any males. And so these are the backgrounds of the social groups that we're looking at. And so, of course, we can expect these different social groupings to also inform the kind of behavior that we're going to see. And so also in horses, it's worth noting that we had these different male statuses. So this picture, you can see, if I can use my mouse, you can see, so here we have a harem of horses. And so typically in the harem, so while some males are associated with a harem, we'll also have other males that group together with other males. And these are the bachelor groups. And so these are where males who don't have a harem, or young males that have just dispersed from their social group, they go out and I think have a whale of a time just hanging out with other males and just doing whatever they please. But then the status that all males seem to desire to attain is to be a harem stallion. And so this is sometimes referred to as like a dominant stallion, so this is the male who is closely associated with the females and that you always see associated with the group. But we found that in a lot of, or in some groups on the range, we also found males that we called lieutenants. And so these are males that are associated with the group and are often sort of in the middle of the group, that they have some association with the mares, but they're not as in depth with the group as the harem stallions. And then we would also sometimes see these what we called tag males, which are bachelors, which just sort of float along behind the group. And they're never a part of the group, and they would just sort of hang out with the group, following it around for a little bit, and then they might head back off and join the bachelor group. And so we could really split these groups into, there would be some groups that would just have a harem stallion. So it would just be one harem stallion and the mares and their offspring. And then there would be other groups that we called multi-male groups, where they would have either a lieutenant or a tag or both. So when we're looking at the behavior of the horses, the first thing that we look at is something that we call time budgets. So how do they spend their time across the day? And in our study, the 4 key things that we looked at across the day were how much time do they spend feeding, moving, standing, and lying down. And then we could look at the percent of time that they spend doing each of these behaviors. And we would also record if an animal was out of sight. And then we also did have a category that we called other. So if a horse was doing something that was incompatible with any of these other behaviors, then we would just note it as an other. So if at that 10-minute time point, the horse was lying down having a good roll, then we would record that as other, and we would just record that the animal was rolling. And so there's been a decent amount of research on looking at wild horse time budgets. And typically horses spend somewhere around 50–60% of their time grazing. And then the rest of the time they spend either moving or in some kind of rest. So either standing or lying down. And in our data, so this is looking at the time budgets across different months. So across the summer, so this is from April to September. And we were surprised that we only found around about 25% of the time was spent feeding. And this could be due because these observations are largely in the summer. And so undoubtedly these animals were spending more time feeding at night. And we could also look at the amount of time that they spent moving. So they spent a lot of time standing. And so this is the horses here in blue. And so they spent a lot more time standing in the summer. And then when we look at the burros, which are these 2 graphs below, we can see that they spent a bit more time feeding than the horses. But the donkeys, the amount of time that they spent feeding was really affected by the weather. So as the weather cooled off, they would spend more time eating. And also they really focused when the time of the year that they spent the most time eating was when the vegetation was most green. And then when we break it down so we can look at the sexes. So we have females in the pale gray and males in the darker gray. And again, we've got horses in the blue and burros in the sort of the pinky red colors. And so this enabled us to really look at the difference between both the different species. So if there was a difference between horses and burros, and also between the sexes. And so in general, we found that donkeys spent a lot more time feeding, moving, and lying down than horses did. But horses spent more time standing than burros. And in the horses, we saw that the females tended to spend a lot more time feeding than males did, which makes sense because the females normally had foals. But in horses, we found that the males tended to move a bit more than the females. And so we definitely found differences between the 2 species and how they spent their time. And we found a difference in the sexes. And when we looked at the social interactions, we also found that there was differences between the horses and between the donkeys, and also that there was some sex differences between the 2 species. So there's a lot to unpack in this figure. So now I'm just going to take each of these different types of behaviors, and I'll break it apart and talk about really the kind of behaviors that we looked at. So the first of these behaviors I'm going to talk about are agonistic behaviors. And so these are the aggressive behaviors. And so I think when a lot of people think of stallions, they think of a lot of these behaviors. So you've got bump push, which is where the horses will sort of throw their chests into each other, biting and kicking, which I think everyone is familiar with. So chasing, when one horse or burro would run after another, rearing, where they're up on their hind legs, striking when they go out with a front hoof, and then boxing, which I think a lot of the classic pictures that we have of stallions are when they're both up, rearing, and then yeah, trying to hit each other with their front legs. Another behavior that we recorded was this arched neck threat. And so this is often when, yeah, stallions can look really beautiful when they're like arching their neck, but they're really posturing towards another stallion. And then stallions will often also do a parallel walk where they walk next to each other as part of this posturing. And then we also had herding. And so that's where males put their head. And so this is only horses. We never saw this in burros, but the male horses put their head in a very specific, a low position with the ears back and make this kind of snaking movement with their neck. And they do this to move mares, to move the females out of the way. But across all of these agonistic behaviors, interestingly, we saw a lot more of these, except herding, in donkeys than we did with horses. And in horses, we saw these a lot more in males than we did by females. And especially this was done by sort of like prime aged horses with, we saw very little agonistic behavior from very young or relatively old horses. And we saw a lot more of this in the summer than we did in the spring. And in donkeys, we also saw more of these agonistic behaviors in the summer and the spring. But in donkeys, we saw this more in the older individuals. Those tended to be the ones that we saw the most agonistic behaviors from. And so another thing I think we always think of with agonistic behaviors is about dominance. But other research looking at horses has really been it's not always as straightforward as just thinking that there is a dominance hierarchy of like, horse A is always the dominant over another horse. And also, interestingly, in research, when they've looked at dominance hierarchies, the stallion isn't even always the top. Sometimes a mare will be more aggressive than the stallion. So the other behaviors that we looked at were affiliative behaviors. And so these are the friendly behaviors that horses do to each other. And so this is often shown by mutual grooming. So this is where you see the two horses that they stand next to each other and they just nibble on each other. And then very, very rarely we saw non-reciprocal grooming, which is where one individual would do this and not another. In my Przewalski's horse research, I never ever saw the non-reciprocal grooming, which I think is really interesting. So almost always when one horse or burro starts to groom the other one will then reciprocate so that they always do it to each other. Touch is something that we recorded, and because touches in horses are almost always friendly. So like that picture I had at the beginning where horses like lay their heads on each other or simply just come up and just sort of just touch each other is often really sweet. And the other behavior that we recorded was play. And so in these affiliative behaviors, again, we saw a lot more of this from donkeys than we did with horses. And in horses, we saw a lot more of these affiliative behaviors also by males than we did by females. And so play is a really fun behavior. It's always fun to see this. And so both of these pictures are stallions. So we've got Przewalski's horse stallions as well as wild horse stallions who are, so this is in a facility in Oklahoma. And yeah, and you can see that I think we're so used to thinking of stallions like fighting and always going up to each other and fighting, but they also spend a lot of time playing. And then we saw this often out in the range, and it's been, yeah, I've seen it with Przewalski's horses as well, that you see a harem stallion like leave their group of mares and run over towards the bachelors, and you think like, oh my gosh, there's going to be a really big fight. And then the stallion joins the bachelors and then plays. So this Przewalski's horse standing up on his hind legs, yeah, he was a harem stallion, and then he went and joined the bachelors to have a good play. And we can tell that it's play. Typically the ears are held out more sideways, and it's just more sort of there's more back and forth than there is in aggression. We also recorded reproductive behaviors. And so this is things like nasal contact, when they take those deep breaths from each other's noses. So genital sniffing, phlegmon, which is where they roll up their lip and draw in air over their vomeronasal organ. So typically to detect hormones or something strange. And then we recorded where the mares presented to a stallion, and they make it very clear that they're in heat and they would like his attention. And we recorded also instances of mounting and copulation. We also had on our ethogram forced copulation, but I don't think that we saw that at all in our study. And we also recorded masturbation, and which is not something that is very comfortable to talk about in our society. But here is this African wild ass at Denver Zoo. So he was out there on public display, showing his fifth leg. And in all of these reproductive behaviors, we saw these more often in horses than we did in donkeys. We also recorded scent marking. And so this is something which is very ritualized in horses. And so we saw more of this in horses than we did in donkeys. And we saw it more by horse males than by horse females. And so in stallions, this is a very ritualized behavior. And so out on the range, you'll often see these stud piles or big dung piles where stallions repeatedly mark in the same place. And they use these stud piles as kind of signposts to show that they have been in the area. And sometimes they'll also mark on these stud piles as part of when they're displaying with another stallion. And it's a way that they can really get familiar with each other's scents. And they mark it in this way that the stallion will first of all go up and sniff the stud pile. Then he steps over it with an arched neck and deposits more feces on top. And then he turns back around and sniffs it again. And so you'll see this almost every time they mark on a stud pile. With donkeys, we also found that this was done more by males than females. But in burros, interestingly, we saw this across all ages and by both sexes. So we almost never saw a female horse doing scent marking, but with the burros, we would see it in the females as well, and also in foals. And this is similar to other research I've been involved in, where we looked at this in different zebra species and in African wild asses in zoos. And so this really seems to be related to the social system of the animals. So in horses, it's almost entirely done by the male, because the males are the ones to be like, hey, I'm associated with these females. Whereas with donkeys or burros, because they can be coming together and going apart, I think that they all want to know their scent in relation to the others. Then we also recorded vocalizations, and I'll see if I can get this video to play. Hopefully you can hear the sound. So that is the classic donkey bray. That anyone who's spent time with donkeys is very familiar with this. And so so to start at the bottom of this list, we had like the donkey bray, and also especially when jacks were fighting, we would often hear their sort of growling and grunting noises as well, which we heard much less often from horses. But with horses, they have this whinny or neigh, which recent research has shown is really a kind of cross between a whistle and a snort. And the physiological mechanisms enabling horses to do this is quite unique to horses. Then we have a nicker, which is that close contact call, often between a mare and her foal. Then squealing, which sometimes stallions would do. And then we have the different nasal noises, which are things like snorts, blows, and whiffles. And so the whiffle is that blubbery sound in the lips that horses make, which other research has shown is often associated with positive emotions. And so in domestic horses, they found that often when horses did it, that they were feeling good, and they often would do it in their pasture, and Yeah, and when they were not feeling stressed. And I've noticed that sometimes it can also be a bit contagious with horses. And there's current ongoing research that's looking at these different kinds of snorts, blows, and whiffles to really dig a bit deeper into what they mean. And so I think that horses are making a lot more variety of different sounds often than we appreciate. Oh, okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about research that we did. So digging deeper into this data set, looking at stallion behavior and female choice. And so first of all, so one study part of the study that we did, we looked at the effect of gelding on some of these males in Congo. And we were really interested that we found surprisingly little effect on their behavior. And so still we found no effect of gelding really on their time budgets, on agonistic behavior or reproductive behavior. So it didn't make these horses, it didn't make geldings were not less aggressive, and they still wanted to hang out with mares. And so even after, so in the top graph, so in the black bars, you can see that even 4 years or 3 years after they'd been gelded, some males were still trying to associate with females, or females were still associating with those males. And we had one gelded harem stallion who kept his mares throughout the study. But the difference that we did see was if the male was gelded as a bachelor, then he tended to remain as a bachelor, whereas others that were in that cohort, most of them became harem stallions. And we also had genetic data on these horses, so we could look at paternity of the foals, which was really fascinating to me, at least. We found that there was a strong reproductive skew in these populations, meaning that we had surprisingly few males that produced most of the foals. So across two populations, we found that only 9% of the males produced 45% of the foals. And there was a strong female choice for these single male harem stallions. So those were those males that didn't have any lieutenants or tags, that it was just the one male with the females. So the females seem to really prefer those males for the paternities. And so even if the female did have an extra group paternity or a sneak mating, that she went to another group to get pregnant from another stallion. So mostly they did return to their social group. And even if they went to find another stallion to be the daddy of their baby, they were still going out and choosing these single male harem stallions. And so this, I think, really points to the fact that although we think of horse societies as being very male dominant and the males guarding their females, and we talk about the female resource defense, but in fact the females have a lot of choice about who they are using to father their foals. And when we dug deeper into this, looking at behavior, we wanted to see if agonistic interactions, so if that, like the stallion being dominant and doing all of that herding, if that helped the stallion ultimately produce more foals. But we found that there was no effect either on the number of foals that the stallion had or the length of time that he spent as a harem stallion. So the harem stallions that were more aggressive, that spent more time herding, trying to retain the females, actually it didn't affect how many foals they had. Whereas when we looked at affiliative behavior, so these are those friendly interactions, we found a really strong relationship. So that males that had more affiliative interactions with the mares in their group, that they had more foals and they spent more time as a harem stallion, and then also they would spend more time closer with the females. And so that you can really see this as how that in those groups where you had these really tight bonds that were driven by friendship, those are the groups where the stallion had more foals. So to wrap it all up, what does this all mean? So watching horses out on the range is really a wonderful thing that to be able to do. It's really a soap opera being out watching them, because you see, mares choosing to change groups, and and then stallions that leave, or that another stallion comes in. And so it's a constant soap opera, really watching what's going on there. And out on the range, they really get to live their own lives and really be their own person. In a way, they have so much more agency than the horses that we have living in our pastures are able to do. But they're also, both the horses and the burros are following the behaviors of their ancestors. So they're driven by these ancestral social systems. And both the horses and burros have these really complex social lives that are largely driven by friendly interactions. And so I think, yeah, it's always good to focus time really looking at these friendly interactions between horses and burros and not just the agonistic ones. And also, yeah, females really have a lot of choice in their mating partners. I think we have a lot of rhetoric around horses about how the males really take charge, but the more that we look at the data, the more we found that actually the females have a lot of choice in everything that's going on. And so when we're looking at the difference between horses and burros, they really are very different. They're a completely different species. They're separated by about 2 million years of evolution. So they're really very different species. And we found that they have really quite different behavior, and they also have a different social system. With the burros, I think that we think of burros as being very sort of stoic, but which they are. But we also saw a lot more agonistic and affiliative interactions between burros than we did with horses. And this is maybe a result of the different social system that they have with horses. I think that with horses, they live in these social groups that they're together all the time. So they possibly don't need to be constantly reinforcing how they feel about each other. Whereas with burros, when they might go apart and then when they come together, they're like, oh yeah, this is exactly how I feel about you. So then, yeah, just to thank, yeah, so we worked with BLM on all of these projects and they provided a lot of support. And yeah, thank you so much to USGS for all of the funding, as well as to CSU. And yeah, and thank you to our excellent field crews for collecting all of these great data. But now I'm happy to take any questions.